Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second of the three series Andrea Harris Task Force Business Engagement Group DEI Discussion Lunch and Learns. I am Evan Grant, and I serve as the Policy Director for the North Carolina Department of Administration. Aside from striving to enhance the lives of North Carolinians by providing foundational support to state government through asset management, advocacy, and operations, the North Carolina Department of Administration maintains a portfolio of boards and commissions, including the Andrea Harris Task Force. Established under Executive Order 143, the Andrea Harris Social, Economic, Environmental, and Health Equity Task Force addresses the social, environmental, economic, and health disparities in communities of color disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. The task force is named in honor of the late civil rights activist, Andrea Harris, who dedicated her life to eliminating disparities in North Carolina, co-founding the nonprofit Institute of Minority Economic Development in Durham, and serving as the state's advisory council for historically underutilized businesses. The 5 focus areas of the task force are access to healthcare, economic opportunity and business development, educational opportunity, environmental justice and inclusion, and patient engagement. You can learn more about the Andrea Harris Task Force on our website. The series of Lunch and Learns was the brainchild of one of our active and engaged members who wanted to strengthen the public-private partnership bridge by aligning the 21 social, environmental, economic, and health recommendations of the task force provided in December of 2020 to the governor. This work is to think about the best practices of private companies in North Carolina. These Lunch and Learns are an opportunity for the businesses across our state to discuss some of their successes and challenges with implementing various DEI initiatives within their organization. We hope these conversations will connect businesses struggling to adopt these practices, will inform state agencies on potential avenues for implementation, and encourage participants to advocate for DEI initiatives in their organizations. Again, I welcome you to day 2, which is internal diversity, equity, and inclusion training and employee business resource groups of the Andrea Harris Task Force Business Engagement Group DEI Discussion Lunch and Learns. And with that, I will pass it over to Justin Truesdale, our Business Engagement Group Chair, to discuss the Business Engagement Group and his purpose and vision for this series of conversations. Justin.
Thank you, Evan. Again, welcome to our second of 3 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Discussion Lunch and Learns. I'm Justin Truesdale, a partner at Smith Anderson Law Firm here in Raleigh and chair of the Business Engagement Group. As previously mentioned, the task force was formed to address the social, environmental, economic, and health disparities in communities of color in North Carolina. The task force was formed and worked on a number of recommendations and action items to help improve in the areas directed by the governor's executive order. Upon beginning this work, the task force leadership recognized that many of the things that were being done were from a public government standpoint and did not want to overlook the role that the private industry in North Carolina could play in addressing many of the issues being faced. So the Business Engagement Group was formed to help with engaging the North Carolina business community to aid in tackling the issues the task force was addressing from a different angle. The Business Engagement Group decided that having a series of DEI virtual conferences would allow us to connect businesses across our state with other businesses and public entities that have adopted DEI programs that have thrived and had positive outcomes. We believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is an area where companies are not competing, but will mutually benefit from their competitors adopting similar programs. And we think this is a venue where everyone can learn from each other. Today's Lunch and Learn will be centered on internal diversity, equity, and inclusion training and employee business resource groups. We will hear from 2 industry and organization leaders in DEI training and employee resource groups. With that being said, thanks to everyone for attending. And I would like to pass the mic back over to our moderator for today's panel, Evan Grant, to introduce our panelists and begin the conversation.
Awesome. Evan. Thank you, Justin, and thank you for your vision for this space. I know it's something we've been working on for almost a year now, and so it's good to finally see that come to be. And so I want to start by introducing our panelists this morning. I would like to start with Danielle Pavlov, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at SAS Inc. here in Cary, North Carolina. It's a computer software development and analysis company right here in Wake County. And then I would also like to introduce a longtime friend of mine, mentor, former coworker, Nia Fonville, who's the director of externships at Campbell Law School. If you noticed on the invitation on the registration website, we did have a third panelist, Brooke Cummings, the Senior Vice President of HR for Curie. Unfortunately, she emailed this morning and said that she would be unable to participate. However, we do send her good vibes and great thoughts today, and hopefully we can have an opportunity to partner with her. If not, in the next panel, another opportunity. But I want to get in and really start discussing this topic because I think this topic has been at the forefront for a lot of people's minds for a long time, but certainly during the pandemic with what we've seen in the arenas of DEI, in the arenas of social justice, in the arenas of workplace inclusion, workplace behaviors, workplace environments, and belonging. And so I really want to jump in and just kind of get into this topic and talk about it. And so where I want to start is what I just kind of want to give color to what DEI training kind of is and how that looks in different organizations. You know, a lot of organizations may call it implicit bias training, unconscious bias training. A lot of organizations may have a space where they're getting groups of employees together, getting groups of team members together to have what they call uncomfortable conversations or you know, collective or collaborative conversations. Or you may have businesses that have an actual, we call it LMS, the Learning Management Center, or some online course offering that employees have to take to learn more about DEI. And really what that is trying to inform employees of what the expectations are when it comes to workplace culture, when it comes to creating a diverse workplace, bringing in as many perspectives, personalities, talents, observations, experiences, when it comes to equity, making sure that we're providing equitable accommodations to all of our employees, our team members, our clients, our staff, up and down the chain, across the chain, but then also inclusion, which is making sure everyone feels a part of the work that we do, whether that's in being a part of the team, whether that's in being heard when it's time to make decisions, whether that's being able to give feedback and insight. And so wanting to use the opportunities to train our teams, to train our employees about how to create DEI spaces. And through that, a lot of organizations implement various DEI trainings internally. And so I kind of want to start with Danielle, knowing that, you know, as the Chief Diversity Officer, I actually used to work at SAS and pretty familiar with some of the work that you all there. Can you discuss a little bit about the DEI trainings that you do, what kind of organizations or education that you offer in your organization, and kind of speak to the parameters of what that training might look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you so much, Evan. So hello, good morning, everyone. As Evan and Justin mentioned, I'm Danielle Pavlov. Just to give a little bit more context to my background, I am the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at SAS globally. And part of that role is really serving as a consultant to the organization. So, you know, of course, working with our HR teams, our, you know, people teams, our training development, recruitment, but also working with our business leaders as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here today and kind of what that looks like. But from a SAS perspective, so we are a very large organization. We have, well, I say very large, right? But really compared to other tech software companies, we're actually quite small, but we are about 12,000 employees around the world. And we have employees in 59 countries. So when you think about just the great diversity that exists within a small or a large, however you want to define it, you know, 12,000 people in 60 countries. I mean, that's a lot, right? So we're talking different languages, cultures, religions, backgrounds. So there's a lot to consider when we think about rolling out employee training initiatives. So of course, you know, as a large organization, we have a lot of compliance training, you know, a lot of trainings to help employees to be able to effectively do their jobs, right? So things like productivity training, technology training, flexible work training, right? So we have a lot of training. So I think that's important to note, right? That once you start to add on more required trainings, right, it starts to be almost like a detractor from the actual content itself. So I just want to provide that context because I do think it is really important to kind of think about as you're thinking about DEI training or education initiatives, awareness initiatives for the company, that you start to add in all these additional trainings, right? And it's a lot for employees, right, to take on. So at SAS, we do have 2 required DEI related trainings that are, I should say, that are not compliance oriented. We do have a compliance course for our managers that's around sexual harassment prevention. Again, we're talking a lot of compliance oriented things. But our 2 employee trainings that are required for all employees around the world to complete. The first is what we call Diversity, Inclusion, and Bias Foundations. And the second is very specific to unconscious bias. And I'll real quickly just kind of explain the difference here and kind of why we decided to implement these trainings. Then I'll pass it over to Nia. But for the first training, the Diversity, Inclusion, and Bias Foundations course, this is an e-learning, a self-paced e-learning that we actually created in-house. And that was a very intentional decision because we really wanted it to meet us where we're at in our DEI journey and to establish a baseline for how we're going to move forward with our diversity and inclusion programs, content. So it included a lot of, kind of defining what diversity and inclusion mean at SAS. What are concepts that we're going to be talking about, things like privilege and intersectionality, and really pulling in all of the conversations we were already having, but we wanted to continue to have to move us forward in our DEI journey. So that way we knew that, we're kind of leveling the playing field as far as our DEI competence goes. So that, again, is a required course. Every employee, is tasked with completing it. We did this back in 2020, I believe. I can't remember 2020 time. Yeah, I think end of 2020. And then all new hires have to take it upon starting at the company. So again, we're establishing that baseline as well as accountability, right? And then the second course that we launched at the same time, we called it Module 1 and Module 2, was a vendor training by an organization called Covey, a very big thought leader in the unconscious bias space. And it's a fantastic training that really speaks to more about like the neuroscience, right, of unconscious bias. And again, we've got a lot of software developers, analytical folks, right? So the more we can tie it to, it's just natural human variation, right? And bias, right? It's innate to who we are, and making sure employees really understood that, but then also equipping them with tools and resources through Covey on how to turn all of that into action, right? And so that was a required e-learning as well, except for managers. Managers are required to take a live facilitated version with a instructor, a trained instructor, to engage in conversations around how does this translate to the role of a manager, right? And, things like team bias, hiring bias, all the other types of bias, groupthink, things like that, right? And then how do we kind of navigate those spaces on our teams? And so again, had a kind of global context to it. So that's a lot to unpack, but what I would like to leave folks with is that training is important, right? Again, it gives a baseline and it establishes accountability, right? Like you can't say you didn't know. So I do think that's important, but I also want folks to understand that training isn't always the solution for change, for raising awareness. I do think there are other ways to build on the training, which can talk a little bit more about. And I recently read this really great, I don't know if it's a case study or a journal article, but it's by Burson. If you're familiar with Burson, they do all kinds of great research, like employee HR research, and it's called Elevating Equity. That's the name of this case study journal article. And it talks about how, while training is important, while employee resource groups are important, the biggest driver for change related to DEI in our organizations is actually business strategy. And again, you got to have that foundation, but business strategy is actually the most impactful, and training and your programs, right, are ancillary to that. But I found that really profound, that again, training is important, but having that commitment from the top down is another driver for the importance of things like this.
Yes, certainly. Thank you for that, Danielle. And I think that's actually a good segue as Nia answers the question, because I know Nia to wear multiple hats, and so I'm sure there's probably someone who's like a director of externships. How does that relate to DEI? And you would be surprised. But Nia, I think some of the other hats that you wear in this DEI space, I think, start to speak to that business strategy component. But speak a little bit to kind of some of the DEI things that are happening that you're familiar with, particularly in academia as a place of work, whether that be a private school such as Campbell, or even in the public schools, where we see DEI training is multi-layered, because you have that of the employees, but then you also have that relationship between the employees and the students, where there needs to be that same understanding of equity and inclusion. And so a little bit kind of to some of the trainings that are offered, both there where you are, but then also in some of the relationships and other organizations that you are a part of, and kind of give color to that a little bit.
Absolutely. And so you're absolutely right. Sometimes on its face, it's Nia Pavlov, Director of Externships. What is she adding to the conversation? But I think it goes to show how everybody has a role to play in this conversation. When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about how can you integrate those notions in whatever circles you infiltrate, whatever rooms you sit in, where the conversations that you're a part of. And so there's something Danielle said that I thought was really important, which is, number one, trainings, they are important. You have to have a foundation. Trainings of some sort, but they can't be one-off. The trainings in and of themselves, they're not going to fix the problem. So there has to be action tied to it. And I think that's important, especially with where we are in this space today, because even if we just look at everything since 2020, companies, organizations, everybody has developed some type of DEI statement, and they sound really, really good. We have on our website that we are an equal opportunity employer. And I mean, they sound good, right? But what has happened is, for a large part, folks are feeling that this is performative allyship and performative support. You're not really valuing me as an employee. You're not saying, Nia, who you are is integral to the success of our organization. It's integral to the services we provide to our consumers or clients, whatever that base stakeholder is for you. And we want you and need you to show up as your true self in order for all of this to work. And so before we get to trainings, I looked at the list of where some of you are representing from as attendees. And so I know with that, if we're talking about public sector, private sector, big law firm, a corporation, academia, local government, state government, where there's different amounts of red tape and bureaucracy and processes, some things that take 10 steps for approval when you're like, I think this could be done in 2. So what's happening? We have to recognize that there's no one size fit all. And because there is no set formula, what I encourage you to do as we move through today is to take tidbits from what you hear, both from, myself and Danielle and Evan, but also in the chat. If there's something that resonates with you, if there's something that you all are working on, even if it's not a fully formed idea, throw it in there, because then you'll take those things and make them, you'll find what works within the unique considerations of your community. I needed to say that before I went to answer your question, Evan. Because I really like to start these conversations so people know they are conversations. You're not supposed to have all the answers. We don't even have all the answers. DEI is a journey. I'm sure you've heard it, but a journey means there's movement. So where you were today, you want to make sure you're further along than you were yesterday, but you're not quite where you're going to be tomorrow. And I think that kind of helps me manage this, especially when I find myself in situations where I don't feel that we're making the moves that we should make, or we're not having that buy-in like Danielle was talking about, and I know we'll talk about buy-in a little bit later. But so when we're looking at training, some of us are at the beginning of this journey and we're like, I don't even know how to do the foundation. And one thing that I am glad the law school did was engaged a DEI consultant to really check the temperature and the pressure. What's going on at this school? And you're engaging all stakeholders. So it's faculty, staff, students. Are there some community partners that need to be involved in the conversation of how well you're doing? Because we all think, hey, if you look at the number of students we have, the tuition that's coming in, we are successful. If you look at your budget and your business bottom line, you're saying we are successful. But sometimes when you are in the midst of the program, you can't clearly see I'll just say challenges or opportunities for growth that lay ahead of you, you know, and this isn't a time to be prideful. If we really want to be serious about this work, we gotta have those uncomfortable conversations. And you've probably heard lean into the discomfort, because that's where transformational change is going to take place. And so engaging that DEI consultant, we're in the process of receiving his report so that we can figure out what works best for Campbell Law School. So that's what you have to do. When Danielle was talking about, and I want to get the name right, the diversity, inclusion, and bias formation training was in-house. And I know some of you are like, oh my goodness, but if I don't know what I'm doing, how am I going to create a training? Staff, y'all have all of these minds there, but the value in it, and I think what the point is staff has figured out a way to structure and create something with their community in mind. So it incorporates the unique needs, the unique challenges that their stakeholders may face. And I think that's what we have to do. So in that vein, some of the things that I've done both in the law school and outside the law school, I do direct the externship program. And so that means I partner with community organizations, legal offices, judicial chambers, and there's some type of supervising attorney who is overseeing my students. And for instance, last April 21st, I think that's when it was, last month, I held a CLE training that talked about not only how to successfully supervise students, but there was a DEI lens. So how do you, at each level of supervision, whether it's onboarding and orientation, project assignment and delivery, communication as a whole, providing feedback, how do you do that incorporating an equity and inclusion lens? Recognizing that cultures are tied to our identities and they impact the way we as humans engage with systems and the world, the lens through which we see the world. And so how can you be an effective supervisor to these law students, and at the end, showing supervisors how their engagement with students, that student's sense of belonging. And so that's the same thing you would do in your offices. I do a similar training for legal organizations where it's kind of this human first approach to engagement. How do we engage with each other in our offices? How do we engage with clients? How do biases manifest themselves in our conversations and our representation to clients? And how do we interrupt those biases? And more importantly, how do we, if and when, and I'm going to say when missteps and blunders happen, when I realize, oh my goodness, I kept saying he, him for Evan and his pronoun is they, them. How do I recover both in the moment and long term? How do I educate myself? And so the trainings, we're taking these concepts and applying them to your staff, what you need, your stakeholders. I also do the same with board work. I sit on the board of Wake County Read and Feed, and so we tutor students in learning, and we developed a series of training for this year where I started out with the board. What does your conversation surrounding DEI look like? Then we're doing a training with the staff of Read and Feed. And then finally, a training with the volunteers and the tutors. How do you engage with students? Many of the tutors may be white and the students are students of color. So how do you engage with communities that are a little, that might not be something that you are familiar with? And of course, these are generalities because we want to make sure we're not operating in stereotypes, right? But it's a matter of, one, checking the temperature of your organization and then developing the training that works best for you all. And I'm going to say for SAS, I like the idea of there are some that are mandatory, but only a limited amount because you want people to see the value of the work. And sometimes if you say this is tied to my job, I'm just kind of like, wait a minute, I'm an adult. I don't need you to tell me what kind of training I need, but recognizing there's some foundational stuff that we all need, and then additional trainings based on interests of certain groups or things of that nature. But after the training, you got to be willing to put in the work. And I think that's the next step.
Yeah, no, this is great, and for our listeners, I keep looking at our attendee list. I hope you're kind of taking some of these nuggets. Even I'm over here taking notes, and this is still work that I do, and I'm still always learning. But I'm hearing some good nuggets, and I know because you all knew what the questions were in advance, you actually kind of gotten into what are some of the successes that you've been having, because that's important to talk about. Yes, there are trainings we have. Whether they're online trainings, whether they're in-person trainings, whether they're CLEs, continuing legal education, or whether they're conferences, training is great, but we also need to talk about the successful ones because not all of them work. And to Nia's point, having a consultant come in, and maybe it's hard for you to be in the house that's on fire and really pay attention to the fire that's happening, where you might need somebody from the outside to come in and start having those conversations with all of your stakeholders. And I know that the consultant she's speaking of, because they even reached out to alums. And so really engaging the entire community to say, what is really happening when we pull back the blinders of what we believe our organization is, and really involve ourselves in what will make the space welcoming. To Danielle's point, maybe you have the resources within your company to create something in-house. I recognize some of you may be coming from public sector. Some of you may be from smaller businesses that don't have 12,000 employees in 60 countries. You may have 12 employees in 6 offices. And so you may be like, we don't have somebody who can build that in-house. But Danielle did add in the chat, some resources that are there. Maybe you're having to get some outside resources, and that actually gets to the next point that I want to speak to. Is there are successes. There are places where we've seen tremendous change. There are places where we've seen a lot of intentionality around DEI, but I want to kind of move into some of those barriers and some of those obstacles. One could be resource and time, Danielle. Everybody doesn't have the time or the resources to build an in-house in-house program. And to consultants, one organization may not be able to afford a consultant to come in for 6 months. But before anything can happen, one of the issues we tend to run into, aside from time, aside from resources, is something you brought up, Nia, which was buy-in. How do we get that buy-in? I know you talked about it too as well, Danielle, is it kind of has to start from the top down. And so Nia, based on your experience within the organization and outside in your relationships with other organizations, can you speak to that experience of getting that buy-in and how do you engage people to want to be a part of this? And I see Joe in the thing said, how do you keep politics void of these discussions, which is a whole different barrier. But yeah, I'll start with you, Nia, to kind of talk about that buy-in and some of those challenges and barriers.
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk about one of the challenges that I had on myself when I started doing this work. So I identify as a Black woman born in the South. And when I first started doing this work, it was like, listen, everybody is going to agree, right? Like, nobody thinks racism is a good thing. And when I'm using racism as the placeholder just because of part of that intersectionality of my identities, but all of these isms, like, you're supposed to treat people good, period, right? So I approach these conversations from the perspective of this is the right thing to do. Hard stop. And while I still think it is the right thing to do, what I also had to think about, my lawyer brain is, listen, when you are delivering a message, your audience is important. So you need to focus on who is your audience and how do you tailor your message in a way that it's received. And once that perspective kind of landed on me, it helped me not be as frustrated in conversations. And so what I started doing for myself is saying, okay, there are some people who because this is the right thing message works for. Other folks, when I'm talking to executives and partners in law firms and organizations, I go with that business bottom line and how if your employees aren't engaged, if they don't feel valued, their lived experiences acknowledged, then it's going to have a trickle down effect on their performance, which is going to be tied to your services to your client or consumer base. And so showing that business, like it's a business imperative for you to care about these topics, that started getting, more folk. Because again, my goal is to get you on board and a part of the conversation, recognizing that it's going to take a different type of message for each person. And so so that's one thing. Then if you think about the organizations itself, I will tell you, and this is full transparency, but if you remember, I said this is a conversation. There's no judgment attached. In order for us to do this work, we have to have some vulnerability and sense of transparency. And so it's been really hard for me in my current employment because you have your group where you're preaching to the choir, but if individuals who have the authority to make decisions, have the credibility to make decisions, don't buy into this, it's going to make it much more difficult for you to actually engage in change. And so I've been a part of committees both at the law school, at main campus, and while our law school is in Raleigh, the main campus is in Harnett County, so Bowie's Creek. And so the challenge is getting people to understand sometimes that in order to do this, I'm a fan of equity. Not necessarily the focus is equality, because when folks hear equality, they think, well, as long as I treat everybody the same, then it's enough. But if you approach this work from an equity lens, what you recognize is there are inherent imbalances in our systems. Because our systems are based on, racism, homophobia, all of the isms. And because of those inherent imbalances, it's not good enough to say, well, I have this policy and I treat everyone the same based on this policy. But rather, equity demands that we give people what they need to thrive. And that means what someone may need is a little different than someone else. If there's someone who uses a wheelchair, it's not going to be good enough to say, well, I have a front door of the building. There are some steps. No, what the equity piece is, here's a ramp so this person who uses a wheelchair can access this building. It's not going to be good enough to say the building is there, right? And so what I have found is that there is still a disconnect sometimes between the message of what we say is important and that implementation. And I think sometimes people say, well, we don't have the resources for it. Well, you have your strategic planning where you set your priorities, right? So DEI needs to be a part of that strategic planning process. And I mean at every level. So if you're talking about your client services, if you're talking about vendors, if you're talking about operations and other things, where's the DEI lens in each of those? Not necessarily just a standalone DEI section. Because that's the other thing. People think, oh, well, it's one person's responsibility. Danielle is the chief diversity officer. So that means everything equity and inclusion falls with her. No, we all have something to do and a role to play. And I'll tell you, this invisible labor that a lot of us have engaged in over the years based on our membership and various identities, it's hard, right? Like, I don't have the luxury to put this thing down when it's too tiring and then pick up the calls of equity and inclusion when it's convenient. I live with it every day. And so then to come to either work or another community organization, a board meeting, and it's like, oh, you're supposed to just show up, you're smiling, like everything is okay, continue to operate. It's hard. And then say, oh, well, but Nina, you do a really good job at this, so we want you to do it. There's no extra compensation, and there's no revisiting your current duties. So we still want you to do it. Those are challenges that you face. How is it going to always be me? When will other people see that they have a role to play? And what I've done to help combat some of these challenges, I have, internally, I continue to say, hey, this is what I think should happen, but you have to protect your peace. And so a couple things that I've done, I control my externship program. I might not can control the entire university, but I can control my externship program. So that means I have incorporated DEI components to each of my lessons for students, showing them, if you're going to be a lawyer and you're going to be an effective lawyer, you need to be able to engage with a cross section of the population, because if there are any lawyers out there, you're not going to like all your clients. And, probably anybody working with the public, with another human, you recognize you're not going to like all of them, but you have to be culturally competent and understanding the impact of identities on the way we engage with folks. That means for my supervising attorneys, I have these trainings where we talk about, look, you're not just there to supervise generally, but what does that mean? Let's talk about how you can approach this with an equity lens. I have responsibilities in my contracts and agreements with my supervisors that say, we expect you to provide an environment that is X, Y, and Z. And if not, we're going to have problems. And I've had conversations with supervisors before, and students alike, you know, and so, but this is so that I can help those students thrive when they go out into the profession. And then on a personal note, because I know some of you are doing this work and it's burdensome, I recently withdrew from a committee because for 7 months we were talking the talk with promises of action, and at the time where it was time to act, it was oh, wait a minute, we need to hold off even more. That's fine if that's what you're going to do, but I don't have the bandwidth, I don't have the capacity to continue saying the same things over and over again. When you're ready to do the work, let me know and I'll be back on board. So I just wanted to plug that in because sometimes we have to protect ourselves as we engage in this work as well.
Yeah, no, awesome. That was really good and very thorough. And I think it speaks to a lot of components of those challenges. It speaks to not just getting buy-in from you know, the higher ups, which is something I want to talk with you about, Danielle, but also the challenges that internally we have. And then and you know very well, Nia, the space that I was in this work, and it does become burdensome. I think you've probably seen me cry on camera before. Like it gets heavy. And so having those internal challenges where, you know, we kind of have to figure out how to overcome those barriers and then rethink about how we then communicate this work out. Because like you said, to some people, and I think to Joe's point, to make it void of politics, you can keep politics out of the entire equation if you talk about the impact that it has to your bottom line, the impact that it has to your profit, the impact that it has to your employee productivity, the impact that it has to all of the things that keep your business afloat. When people don't feel like they're a part of something, and we're going to get to that in a second when we talk about these employee resource groups, when people don't feel like they're a part of something, it can negatively impact the work that your organization is doing. We're seeing that a lot right now in some of these major companies that keep ending up on the news because their employees want to sue for this, sue for that, union for this, union for that. And it's because they don't feel like they're a part of what's happening in the business. And that's separate from politics. That is just pure, proper business management. But Danielle, I want to talk a little bit about going back to that buy-in, because I mean, you all have things that are mandatory. And, you know, in Nia's case, she has the slice of her pie that she can really control and say, I can do what I want to in this space. And I think that's just probably something I learned from her, just how to operate. Is this is my space? I can do what I want to. But then at the larger space, how do you get that buy-in for somebody at the top to say, no, everybody's required? Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think Nia hit on so many points. I was writing notes. She was talking. One thing that I wanted to just real quick circle back on that she said that was music to my ears. So at SAS, our diversity, equity, and inclusion mission is to infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion into how we think, act, and operate as a business, right? And that is exactly what Nia was saying, that it's an everybody thing. Yes, I have my own strategy, right? Our own strategy for our diversity and inclusion initiatives, but DEI is a part of everything. And so I think that's how you get the buy-in, right? Is instead of saying, hey, we'll say legal team, right? Because we do have a corporate legal team, right? Instead of saying, hey, let's, put all these new initiatives on your group, right? Let's take a look at what you're already doing and see where we might be able to infuse that lens that Nia talked about so it's not necessarily always adding to it. It's just maybe rethinking about the way that we're operating in our processes so that they are more equitable, they are more inclusive. And then once people start to see the results from that, and that is greater belonging, right? Because their teams are saying, oh, wow, we're actually considering things like accessibility, right? Maybe we've never considered that before, right? And now employees are noticing that, right? So it's these little things that we can do that aren't always so daunting as, okay, now everyone has a separate DEI goal. That's great. And I think that's where we'd like to be, right? But maybe that goal is just revisiting your current practices and policies and ways of operating so that they are more, that do have that D&I lens. So I think that's a big way that, I've had success in SaaS in getting these champions in the business, and not that I've had to beg and plead, right? But to say, hey, you're doing this initiative, or there's this process in place, and, have you considered, right, things like, again, accessibility, things like some of your programs that you have, right? Like, for example, recruiting, right? I mean, every hiring manager, regardless of where you are in the organization, right, is talking to candidates, right? Well, what are you doing to make sure your job descriptions are inclusive? What are you doing to partner with your recruiter, right? To say, hey, diversity is important to me. I would like to talk to a diverse slate of candidates, right? How can we make that happen, right? Things like, it'd be great, our recruiters, right? Are we recruiting at diverse professional associations? Are we recruiting from historically Black colleges and minority serving institutions, right? We all have a responsibility, no matter where you sit in the organization, to be asking those questions, right? And taking a look, almost kind of a self-audit of where you sit in the organization, to say, what can we do differently so that it has that lens, right? And that's where I think having some D&I training could be really high impact, to say, and that's actually one of the things that we're talking about at SAS, is almost kind of like these personas, right? Of, hey, if I'm an attorney, what can I do differently to think with inclusion first, inclusion and equity first, right? Talk about high impact training, right? But again, you've got to have that foundational knowledge, that required training to be able to move to that next step. So that's where you can kind of see the progression happen. And that's where I've frankly had some of the best champions within SaaS are things like, hey, we're gonna, infuse D&I into. I'll give you an example, right? So we have a new program at SAS. It's called a marketing. I think it's a marketing rotational program, right? And we've had this now for a few years. It's hiring folks that are early in career. And we have a set number. It's programmatic hiring, right? So we know we're going to hire this many students to go into this rotation program in marketing, right? It's a full-time job. So as this program was launched, I went to our head of marketing and said, hey, we're already boots on the ground at a lot of these HBCUs, a lot of these primarily white institutions, and we're engaged with the Black MBA, groups, or AMA chapters and things like that, to say, let's be really intentional. When we know we've got X number of positions, let's be real intentional in broadening that applicant pool. And wow, we saw the results from that, right? Our head of marketing saw the results of, wow, we've got this really great, well-rounded team that we're bringing into the organization in a full-time capacity, right? And they're our future, right? They're our future leaders of the organization. And now realizing the success of that, she's like, hey, let's go to alumni, chapters. And, it's so amazing when you do these little things, and, business leaders see that and then they really want to be a part of it. And so I think that's part of the buy-in, right? It's getting almost kind of like implanting these ideas, kind of in their head, where they're like, that's a great idea, but then they think it's their idea, so I think those are really more tangible ways, right? So that's one thing. And then I did just want to touch on one other thing that is important, right? We are corporations, we are academic institutions, we are government organizations. There is an element of compliance, right? And we cannot talk about this without talking about compliance. I will tell you that SAS right now is a private organization en route to become public. It's public knowledge, so there's no secrets there. But there is a lot of pressure, I will say, from government institutions, from our customers, to make D&I a priority. So if it's not compliance, meaning we have to do these things, and if we have to do them, why would we not do them better? Why would we not derive value from doing these things, right? We have to make investments in compliance, all of that, right? So let's get a bigger bang for our buck, right, in these efforts. And then that could be a catalyst, right? But then the other thing is, we have customer contracts, very big customer contracts, in all sectors where they're pushing back and saying, we want to see your data, we want to see what you're doing, and good for them, right? And we're starting to do more of that as well. So if the business case of it's the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, as Nia mentioned, it does drive, there's all kinds of data, right? It does drive business results. Diversity leads to greater innovation, greater productivity. You cannot deny that. And if someone does, then they need to do some homework. So maybe that's step one. But I say all that to say, if that is not a good enough business case, those other reasons should be, risk. We've got attorneys here, right? Risk, compliance, that matters too. And for some organizations, that might be where you have to start, right? But again, think about it as not just we're doing this to check a box. We know we have to do it to check that box, right? So let's make this meaningful and let's see, let's use that as our first step and see where we can go from here to take baby steps to get us in the right direction. You don't have to boil the ocean, on year one. And again, going back to that Burson report, it talks about the D&I maturity model. And that first step is compliance. And every organization, let's be real, is going to start there. And that's okay. It's just building out that plan of, okay, if that's where we're going to start, little by little, you start to say, hey, maybe the first year we add in some D&I training, right? Maybe that's your first thing, right? Maybe year two, you say, let's pilot 1 employee resource group or 2 employee resource groups, right? And let's see how it works. And maybe you tie it to some of those compliance initiatives, but you don't stop there. And so I think, again, these are ways that you can build that buy-in to say, yes, this is important, and here's all the data, right, that shows the value, but we already have to do these things. So let's like really do them. We're already spending the time, money, and resources into doing them. So I think that's how we've, not only at SAS, but in my previous organizations I've worked at, sometimes it does start from that lens, and that is okay. But it's a journey, as Nia mentioned, right? Like it's an ever evolving journey. And then we look back, I look back, and in my role, I've now, I've had the privilege and honor of getting to start the D&I program at SAS. And I'll be honest, there were elements that were very compliance driven. I was a recruiter doing D&I work at the time, just like Nia, it was like my side job, and it became my full-time job. But in a lot of cases, it was compliance driven. But we look back 4 years and, oh my gosh, we've done so much, and it was phased. So be patient, get those champions and start small, and then the ripple effect, it happens fast.
Yeah, certainly. Now, this is really good, and kind of taking from a lot of this, one, it's going to be key to figure out how to structure your message to get that buy-in, and figuring out what that baseline thing is to get people on board. And that's going to look different for every organization. And it really comes to creating those relationships, understanding the culture of your organization, and then how to construct that message. Because to Nia's point, everybody might not do it just because it's the right thing to do. And particularly in a business, the right thing don't pay bills a lot of time, a lot of time. And so you have to consider what keeps us going. Once you get that buy-in, it's almost like DEI training is the foundation for informing people on how to now make change and to then create the space for success within the organization. And that's just the baseline. And I think to your point, Danielle, DEI needs to be in everything. It needs to start everywhere, because it is the foundation for success in every aspect of your organization. And then you always have those other, there's compliance piece, the risk management piece, and even to the point of pressure. I know right now, and I think it's Coca-Cola, who, for any of this, the lawyer side of me, for any law firm that they conduct business with, you have to show your portfolio of diverse attorneys who will work on the case. And you can't just have diverse attorneys at your client meeting, but then they never get billed any time. Coke will drop your contract. And I think that corporations and businesses need to be more intentional, put that pressure and say, because diversity and inclusion is important for us as a business, those who we do business with, it needs to be important for you, or we won't do business with you, period. Go ahead, Nia, I see you ready.
Yeah, one thing that I do want to throw in with this compliance piece. So even on the side, the legal profession, I think I just say is behind other industries already. But for law schools in particular, the ABA, the American Bar Association, has now changed their standards, their accreditation standards, where starting, I think it's fall of 2023, you have to show certain opportunities, and they said meaningful opportunities and trainings in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, implicit bias, racism, all of that, those kinds of things. And so now your accreditation is tied to it. And I think that actually, I know that's going to help in this setting, because they're like, oh, wait a minute, now it's real. And again, the old Nia would have been like, wait a minute, why did somebody have to come and tell you this? You know, but this new Nia really just jumped on it, grabbed it, and said, now we have some opportunity. This is something that I have to support what I've been saying. And when you say, oh, well, we don't know how it looks. Well, let me tell you what I do in my class. Oh, you're already doing it? Yeah, because we should have been doing it, you know? But really, I don't want us to take it lightly what Danielle said about some of this stuff might be tied to compliance. And if that's what gets you off the ground, take hold of it and run with it. So that's now what some academic institutions will have to do, because their accreditation is going to be tied to it.
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you. And so this, I want to segue, and we won't be in this space long, over to, you know, something Danielle brought up, which I think is kind of a counterpart to this. We train people to create more inclusive spaces. We train people to create more diverse and equitable spaces, but then we get them into our business and they still feel like they don't belong. Mm-hmm. And I know you spoke to employee resource groups, and I know there at SAS, you all call them employee inclusion groups. And I want to kind of shift over. It's like, now we've trained people on how to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. How do we create a culture and a workspace of belonging, particularly with employee resource groups? And so kind of just for anyone unfamiliar with what employee resource groups are, typically in organizations, they'll create kind of these opportunities for people to have affinity groups that allow them to create a sense of community, a sense of belonging, particularly maybe in environments where they may feel like they are the only one, and that could be an only one of anything. And so by having these employee resource groups, it allows them to find some commonality among coworkers, because what that does is that furthers the mission, because they feel tied to the organization. And I know we talk a lot about this new generation not staying at jobs long. That really comes to wanting to have a passion and wanting to have a loyalty. And if they don't feel like they belong, they'll leave, because it's like, you've not spoken to me, to Nia's point, you've not spoken to me to show me why I matter here. And so Alpha goes somewhere else where I matter. They don't even care how much they're paying them. They just want to matter. And so I want to talk a little bit more, Danielle, about the employee inclusion groups that you all have there at SAS. I know you all have a breadth of them, and one of my good friends, Dwight Thompson, there is really engaged in one of those resource groups. But can you speak a little bit more about what you all do there at SAS, and how these resource groups have really helped build that culture and that environment of belonging?
Yeah, absolutely, Evan. And yes, I work very closely with Dwight. He's amazing, and so he's the reason why I'm here. So thank you, Dwight, for the connection. But yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about ERGs, employee resource groups, or business resource groups. There are so many names, affinity groups, but I will give you kind of like the SAS process, the SAS definitions. So, you know, there's kind of that question of like, what is the definition, right? What is the difference between a business resource group, an affinity group, right? And that varies by organization. So at SAS, any employee can create an affinity group, right? As long as it does not go against things like your code of conduct, your employee policy, you know, it's not discriminating on another group, right? And we have digital platforms, right? So we use a tool called Yammer. It's a Microsoft tool. I know people have Slack and, you know, things like that. But I mean, we have dog lovers group. We have a marathon runners group. We have, volunteer groups. We have all the video game groups, all these groups, right? And that's cool, right? And that's building that sense of community, right? And in its own way, right? And it's a digital space, so it follows all of our guidelines and all of that. That's great. Those are not what we call employee inclusion groups, right? Those are affinity groups, people getting together for shared interests. Point blank, that is an affinity group. Now, and again, every company has different policies around how they do that. So for us, we call them employee inclusion groups, EIGs, and that is a very intentional program, but it's a very intentional name as well. So in order to create an employee inclusion group, an EIG, these are company-sponsored, company-sanctioned groups. They are SAS EIGs, the SAS Military Network, the SAS Black Initiatives Group, right? They are branded, they're a component of SAS, essentially, internally and externally, right? A lot of these other affinity groups, they're just internal for employees, right? To build those connections, which does have value for sure. But the EIGs have very clear missions, right? There's a goal for why we are elevating these beyond being just a social platform, right? And there is business benefit for SAS, and you'll talk about that. But the inclusion group, the reason why we call them that is because their missions are very, very clear that they are open for all, right? And that's very important. Now, the mission itself, right, it could be to serve a particular community, right? But it is inclusive in that it has a point blank, very clear pathway for all people to support that mission, regardless of their own membership of their identities, right? And so there is some balancing, right, that has to happen as a result of that. But I think that that's been really powerful for us at SAS. And so real quick, I want to just give a quick kind of timeline of how these EIGs came about, because I do think it reiterates a lot of what Nia and I have been talking about, and Evan, and some of the comments you've made around kind of the evolution. So our very first EIG, wasn't called an EIG at the time, actually started in 1995. That's a long time ago. EIGs were not, or ERGs, was not a word. It was more of a business resource group. And again, it wasn't even called that, but it was created because there was a business need. We were opening offices outside of the US. We were opening research and development centers in Asia. And so there were language, cultural differences. There were all sorts of considerations that as a Cary, North Carolina based company, we needed help, and our employees jumped right in and said, we are here, to help support. I mean, they willingly, right, raised their hand and said, I want to help. And so that is how the very first, group at SAS was founded, as a way to help us with translations, as a way to help with debugging, a way to help think about how we market, how we hire, right? So it was a very strategic initiative, right, when it first started. Now, mind you, that was many, many years ago, some 27 years ago, if I'm doing my math right. If I'm not, please don't judge me. I'm not a statistician like my coworkers, but since then, we have launched the Women's Initiative Network. That was about 10 or 11 years ago. Our Young Professionals Network was about 7 years ago. And since then, probably about the last 4 or 5 years, we have launched 4 others. So after International Connection, Women's Initiative, Young Professionals, we launched the Veterans Network, the Black Initiatives Group, the Pride, LGBTQ and Allies Network, and then more recently, our Disability Inclusion All Abilities Network. Now, again, that's not to say that we didn't care about these groups and that we didn't have other mechanisms in place. Again, a lot of them were more affinity networks. So these groups existed. It's just, again, we're taking them to the next level. We're elevating these groups. And so each of the groups have strategic plans. And I have an amazing program manager who works on my team, who is kind of governs and supports these groups so that, number one, right, we can put resources, right, behind these plans, kind of put our money where our mouth is, right, and execute. Also to make sure that the people that are doing the work are recognized for that work, because there is a lot of invisible labor. There is, no doubt about it. And so our EIG groups have helped us to see, hey, helped us to understand, right? Here's the impact of, I'm doing all this work, but I also have my job, right? So let's come up with a solution to where I can still help and make an impact, but I'm also still getting recognized and have the time to be able to do this, right? So they helped us to actually create a time tracking code, right? Because employees are still getting paid, right? For most of us at SAS, it's most of us, not all of us, right? It's not only billable, right? For some groups, there are consultants and stuff. For most employees, they're salaried employees, right? So then we have to look at it as, out of that 40 hours a work week, right, that you're essentially getting paid for 40 hours, we need to make sure that you're still getting your work done. But by taking on this EIG work, it doesn't mean that you're now doing 50 hours, right? So there's some balancing. There's been a balancing act of that. And I will say, it's not always perfect. But, we've actually implemented time tracking codes that allow employees to be able to track that time. And of course, it's paid time. And it's not billable time, but it's valuable, and it's on their strategic plans, it's on their performance goals, right? And we're still working on that, right? We're still working on how do we enable the people that are doing the work so that they can go to their management and say, hey, I'm doing these things, this is really important, the organization is backing me. Manager, you should be backing me. This is, again, important work. But then when it comes down for performance review time, that is a consideration, right? For things like bonuses, for things like promotions. And we have seen a lot of that play out, which is really incredible. Again, is it perfect? No. But I do think, again, when you think about ERGs, it is important to have a mission, right? Have a clear mission. Yes, if it's an affinity group, call it that. It's an affinity group, right? And again, that's where many of our groups started. Actually, I think just about all of them started as affinity groups, right? That's okay. But then thinking about, okay, how do we really make sure that these groups are going somewhere? If that's the pathway you go. Now, again, beer lovers group, it's not really going anywhere. Maybe a happy hour, right? But it's not really driving business results, right? And that's okay. But if you're trying to really spin up groups, my advice would be to not do all at one time. Again, maybe pick one or two based off of the needs of your employees, right? Hopefully you do some sort of employee feedback, mechanism, whether it's a survey or feedback, mailbox or whatever, right? That you can gauge and say, okay, let's maybe start with one or two and do them right, and create a clear mission. And frankly, the company, if the company's serious about it, right, then there do need to be investments. Doesn't have to be, $100,000, doesn't have to be anything crazy, right? But you say, okay, if we're going to do this, we want to do it right. And again, it goes back to getting that buy-in from the top, right? Because it does take people power. It does take people power to do this. And so it's up to the organization to decide, are we going to hire someone whose job it is? For about 3.5 years at SAS, I was a team of one. There wasn't a dedicated resource before me, right? And so again, maybe it's a team of one for a short period of time, right? It's a dedicated person who's being paid to do this, right? Like Nia mentioned, you add all these things in, right? But that's in addition to my current job. The scope of my job really isn't changing. You're not paying me for the change of my job. And then now we have a team, right? Because now we've been able to say, here's the plan, here's the impact, this is how we want to scale. And it did require human resources, right? And so I say all that's a lot. I've said a lot. And I'll pause and see if there are any questions, or Evan, if you have anything you want me to kind of double click on. But the best thing I can say for folks thinking about, ERGs or EIGs is, again, buy-in from employees is important, but it can't all be on the employee. There needs to be space, whether it's extra paid time, or there needs to be time that's allocated for whether it's professional development or it's networking time, or else it's probably not going to be successful, and you will probably lose that employee to burnout. That's just the facts. And so again, if you start small, you can kind of scale as you go. But that's how we've had success at SAS, is we started small. We don't have to over engineer, right, but provide a little bit of structure, and then you just kind of make tweaks as you go, and then you decide how you want to scale.
No, that's good. And I'm gonna jump to you, Neil, because I want to talk about that a little bit and a parallel point to that as we wrap up here. But to kind of speak to some of the things that you said, Danielle, and even Joe, to your point, of bringing in those people. Danielle spoke to their groups have strategic plans. Like, they have defined goals that that the members of these groups are understanding of, and I would assume we're a part of building. And to your point, Joe, when employees become part of the solution, they're more invested in the company goals. That's actually something that we're doing here at DOA. Next week, we have an interest meeting for what we're calling temporarily the Young Professionals Resource Group. And it's, kind of like Danielle said, we identified a need, and that was, we recognized, particularly as we see the pipeline of employees as we've come through the pandemic, and we've seen a shift in employees, that we really need to spend time investing in young employees to really develop them within our organization so that they have a space to grow, learn, and be really ingrained in what we do here at DOA. And to part of that is the reason why we're having that interest meeting is to really survey the people who come to say, what do you want this to be? What do you want it to be called? What do you want to do in this space? What would make this space valuable for you, so that then we can build something around what you need to feel like you belong here. And the way we're doing that is actually fairly broad. It's really kind of open to everybody, but we really want to focus on employees who are in their 20s and 30s, or they're within 5 years of working for state government, because you could be, in your 60s and be new to state government and not really know what it takes to really thrive in this space, to really grow in this space. And so, so young may not be the right word. It could be emerging. It could be developing. And so that's what we want to engage the interested people in what does this space need to look like? Let's formulate goals. Let's formulate the intentions of this space so that you feel like you belong. So one, you don't get burned out, so that you don't stop coming. But also, to Danielle's point, the organization has to buy into these spaces that allow the employees the freedom and the flexibility and the comfort to say, I don't just come here just to work. I come here because I belong here. I come here because I'm a part of this. I'm not just here, clicking the time clock, making a widget and going home. I'm here because I'm doing something. And that's what organizations really kind of have to shift their perspective around, is that people want to be remembered as people and not just employees. People want to be remembered as someone, as an individual, and not just another budget line, and so we kind of have to rethink how we open these spaces up. And to Danielle's point, is creating the space, whether that's through time, whether that's through money, for people to get engaged. And so, Nia, I want to jump to you as we close off here, kind of in that same vein, but then also thinking about how external professional organizations add to the breadth of what employees are able to bring into the organization to help it grow from an employee engagement and inclusion space.
Absolutely. And so I actually had unmuted because I was going to ask Danielle a question, and then I saw in the chat you were talking about it. So I'm okay, but I am going to ask one question. Joe's comment had prompted for me. For your EIGs, do they have a budget, and tied with that budget, are there requirements such as annually you have to have 2 events, or, are there some requirements also tied to their formation and maintenance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's also very complex question too, but I will give you a short answer. Let me think of how I want to say this. We're not afraid to invest, right? I mean, and again, that's because we're all in, right? Like, it doesn't always start there. It didn't start there. Again, full disclosure, I don't think anyone will, not to say it was never important, but we were not all in. That's why we, launched the diversity program. So I think, again, to do it right, you do have to put your money where your mouth is, right? You do have, and again, nothing crazy, but for us, what we do is we work very closely. I work very, very closely, and Bennett, my colleague, who was hired to work directly with these groups, he is very intimately involved with their plans, what they're doing. He helps steer them, to make sure that the things that we're doing are very high impact, but also not losing sight of why they're there, right, to create that sense of community. So what we use is a zero-based budgeting process. So we look to them to say, what are you trying to do? What do you want to do? Where our needs lie? And then let's create really meaningful programming. And then as a result of that, we'll do, we collectively do our homework to say, okay, we think this year we're going to need X number of dollars. And then I bring that to our chief human resources officer and say, hey, this is what we think we're going to need to execute on these goals. So yes, there's a budget, but we don't just say, here's $5,000, have at it, go buy food or t-shirts or, not to say that sometimes, there's not value in that, but it does go back to really getting them to think about, if we're going to ask for money, let's make sure it's really meaningful.
Good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Evan started mentioning how we might be able to leverage our membership in professional organizations to take back and carry some of those lessons, tips to help our workplace. And I think that's very important because, as he said at the beginning, I wear many hats. And so, yes, I'm a part of the law school community, but nationally, I'm a part of the clinical legal educators community. At the local level, a part of the Wake County Bar Association, but also membership and leadership in the North Carolina Bar Association. There are certain affinity groups, Capital City Lawyers, North Carolina Black attorneys, women attorneys. And so what I've been able to do, and it didn't start out being intentional. It started out being because I try to do all things at all times. Which is not a good thing. So self-care is important. There's another plug. But what I have seen is over the years, those trainings, either if I'm conducting the trainings or attending the trainings or seeing how these various organizations are developing and maintaining diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, I've been able to piecemeal, take some ideas here and there. We talked about there's no formula to this thing. And so taking some best practices, perhaps, and best practices, that's a loaded term because best is relative. But taking tidbits from here and there and saying, okay, how can I then take this back to my organization? And as Danielle said earlier, let's look at the things we're already doing in our various departments. How can I incorporate what I'm learning or the work that I'm doing in these other spaces to influence home, if you will, and home being the workplace? And what has also been an unintentional byproduct, but something that's been very helpful, is when my dean sees that I have done X, Y, and Z with these external organizations, it's kind of like, wait a minute, I have a resource that has some credibility within my own team. I better start using that. And Evan knows I was not a social media person. I'm still not a social media person, really. But, LinkedIn, Twitter, I have Instagram now, Evan, but using all of that as ways to build relationships and community outside of the workplace. And I think my credibility within the workplace has increased because of my professional association involvement and the tangible work that we're doing there. So leverage those relationships, leverage those opportunities that you have to come back and say, hey, supervisor, hey, head person, these are some things that I'm seeing, I'm being able to experience here in this external space. I think we can adopt some of that information and some of those tactics and initiatives within our space. And that's what's helping. The DEI consultant, I already think we should have a designated executive DEI level officer, which I still think people should have. But it was, okay, if we're not going to go there right now, let's at least engage a consultant, because a consultant can do X, Y, and Z. And I laid it out. It was a report and recommendation. So that's what we did. And so I take that as a win based on experiences in other areas and rooms that I sit in. So try to figure out ways to leverage your membership, those resources. Talk with people, ask them, well, how did you navigate this within your space? Here are some of the challenges that I faced here. What tips might you have for me?
No, that's good. And a great kind of wrap up is, it's not just the advocating within our workplace, but going outside of our workplace and creating these professional relationships that lend to the things we're passionate about, so that we can develop a credibility within our workplace to come back and say, hey, this is not just a me saying we need to do it here. This is happening everywhere around us, and they're making so much more progress than we are because they at least started somewhere. And unless you can go out and say that that's happening and then bring that back, you are kind of talking to a brick wall. And so it's really important that if something is important for you within your workplace, find other spaces within your profession or within your industry where it's already happening, and find out how to get plugged in and connected and being a part of that, so that you at least have something to bring back with you, even if it's just some articles or some research, or if it's actual practical examples of this happened at XYZ company, and look how well they're thriving. Look how much growth they've had over the past year. Look at X, Y, and Z, and we're still over here kind of wading in the water because we're not willing to take those risks yet. And so no, that's really good, and shows the importance of it's a universal thing. It's not just my business. It's not just Campbell. It's not just SAS. It's not just state government. It's universal that we all kind of need to engage with each other on what these issues are and then what these practices are. And so with that, in these last 5 minutes, I just want to say thank you to both of you for all that you've done to help us prepare for this. I do want Justin and Tanya to jump on, and anyone else from my team. Really, and for those of you who attended, thank you for coming today. We could have this conversation for like 5 days straight. There's just so much to talk about, so many nuances, so many spaces that we just haven't even had a chance to just scratch the surface of. I mean, accessibility is a totally different conversation from, the equity we think about when we think about race and gender and sexual orientation, sexual identity. There's a whole other, there's this invisible backpack of identities that Nia teaches about. We could talk about this concept for days, but hopefully you at least got enough to hear that the industry that you're working in, the organization that you're working in, the business that you're a part of, these aren't just obstacles that you're running into. These aren't just things that are important to just you. This is something that is happening throughout the state of North Carolina. And so thank you all for being a part of this conversation. And I want to thank you all for just being here, being attentive. Thank you to those of you who participated in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I can connect you or figure out where to find the answer to those questions. My email address is evan.grant@doa.nc.gov. I put it in the chat. You should have received it as part of the invitation for here. I also want to thank the rest of the team who have helped put this together. So Justin, who's been very instrumental, Tanya Smith and her counterpart, Ebony Pittman from Department of Transportation, who've really been instrumental in helping us move this forward. Tanya will actually be moderating our panel on June 17th. Which is on diversity recruiting and hiring and on-the-job training. So I hope that you're here June 17th to hear from Tanya and the panelists for that. And it's the day before Juneteenth, and so it's just all like a perfect wraparound. And so definitely register for that. Thank you to the rest of my team, Jordan, Gianna. Thank you to Kevin Price, who wasn't able to join us today. He moderated the first panel. And so if you haven't noticed, each panel is a progression. So the first panel, we really talked about that external engagement with your business. And we talked about diverse supplier networks. We talked about that external mentorship among businesses. Today, we talked about what you're doing within your organization. So DEI training, and how do you create that baseline of education and information for change? And then how do you create those inclusive spaces for belonging within your organization to create that level of inclusive culture and that good workplace environment? And so then what we'll talk about in June is now that you know your business is good, you've made these great business connections on the outside, everyone feels like your business is home. How do you now bring in the right people to be a part of this? And we're really going to take that conversation on June 17th to a different space. A lot of times when people hear about diversity, hiring, inclusion, they think race, gender, sexual orientation, but we're really going to kind of get down into it. And we're trying to have some conversations about spaces that we may not always think about when we think about diversity and as it speaks to hiring. So definitely hope you all are part of that conversation. Make sure you register, make sure your friends register. Again, thank you, everyone. I'll see if Justin has any final parting words before we end here. I'm looking forward to June.
Oh, no, Evan, I think you covered it all. I just want to say thank you to Nia and Danielle for agreeing to be panelists on this panel. Evan for moderating. I mean, we heard a lot of great information today that I think will help companies expand on what they're already doing, which I think will help more employees feel included, which in turn will help our communities and our companies thrive, which is the goal of what we're trying to do. So I really appreciate everybody being able to join.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, and hope you all have a great day. I think I'm going to go get lunch now, and so but have a good one. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great weekend.